Hashtag the girl who refused to break. Maria Santos had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her friends painted their nails and talked about boys, she was climbing trees, fixing motorcycles with her father, and dreaming of adventures beyond the dusty streets of Laredo. Her mother often worried that Maria was too wild, too stubborn for her own good. But her father saw something special in his daughter's fierce determination. The morning Maria announced she was joining the Marines, her mother cried for 3 days. The local pastor tried to convince her that military service was no place for a young woman. Even some of her teachers shook their heads, saying she should focus on finding a nice husband instead of chasing impossible dreams. But Maria had made up her mind. She was 18, fresh out of high school, and ready to prove that a girl from a poor Mexican-American family could serve her country with honor. Boot camp at Parris Island was everything Maria expected and worse. The drill instructors screamed until their voices cracked. The physical training pushed her body beyond limits she never knew existed. Every day brought new challenges designed to break the weak and forge the strong. While some recruits crumbled under the pressure, Maria thrived. She helped struggling teammates, never complained during the longest marches, and earned respect through pure grit. During her second month of training, something happened that would change everything. The instructors announced a special helicopter training exercise. Only the top recruits would participate, and Maria had earned her spot through weeks of outstanding performance. She felt proud as she suited up in full combat gear, checking her equipment one final time before boarding the massive military helicopter. The aircraft lifted off on a clear morning, carrying 12 Marines over the South Carolina coastline. Maria pressed her face to the small window, watching the world shrink below. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly, painted in shades of blue she had never seen in landlocked Texas. This was why she had joined the Marines, for moments like these where she felt truly alive and free. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran, briefed them on the exercise. They would practice rapid deployment techniques, learning how to exit the helicopter quickly during combat situations. It was routine training that thousands of Marines had completed safely. But, as Maria would soon discover, routine could turn deadly in seconds. The helicopter reached the designated training area and hovered 200 feet above the ocean. The crew chief opened the side door, and ocean spray misted into the cabin. Maria felt her heart racing with excitement, not fear. She had trained for this moment, studied every manual, practiced every movement until it became second nature. Then, something went wrong. The helicopter suddenly lurched to one side as strong winds caught the aircraft. Maria, who had been standing near the open door, lost her footing. She reached out desperately, her gloved hands grasping for anything solid. For a split second, she locked eyes with Sergeant Martinez, a fellow recruit from California. She saw the horror in his expression as he lunged forward, trying to grab her arm. But physics and gravity had already taken control. Maria plummeted from the helicopter, her scream lost in the roar of rotors and crashing waves. The last thing she remembered was the blue-green water rushing toward her at tremendous speed, and then everything went black. When she regained consciousness, Maria was floating face down in the Atlantic Ocean. Salt water burned her throat and nose. Her combat gear, designed to protect her on land, now threatened to drag her to the bottom of the sea. Every part of her body screamed in pain, but she was alive. The fall should have killed her instantly. Hitting water from 200 feet was like striking concrete. Military experts would later calculate that she had less than a 1% chance of survival. But Maria Santos was not a statistic. She was a fighter who had inherited her grandmother's stubborn streak and her father's refusing to quit attitude. Treading water with enormous difficulty, Maria looked around desperately for the helicopter. She could see it circling overhead, but the distance seemed impossible. The crew was following emergency protocols, radioing for rescue helicopters, and dropping emergency supplies. But help was still hours away, and Maria was alone in the vast ocean. Her military training kicked in automatically. First, she had to shed the heavy gear that was pulling her down. With numb fingers, she unstrapped her combat pack and let it sink into the depths. Next came her boots, then her utility belt. Each item that disappeared beneath the waves improved her chances of staying afloat, but also took away tools she might need for survival. The water was shockingly cold, much colder than the warm Gulf Coast water she had swum in as a child. Hypothermia would become a serious threat within hours. Maria forced herself to keep moving, using techniques she had learned in water survival training. She floated on her back when possible, conserving energy while scanning the sky for rescue aircraft. Time moved strangely in the ocean. Minutes felt like hours. The sun climbed higher, and Maria realized she had been in the water for over 2 hours. Her lips were turning blue, and her fingers could barely move. Dehydration was setting in despite being surrounded by water. Every wave that crashed over her head reminded her how small and helpless she was compared to the vast ocean. But Maria refused to give up. She thought about her father, who had worked 16-hour days in construction to support their family. She remembered her grandmother's stories about surviving the Great Depression through sheer willpower. Most importantly, she thought about her fellow Marines back on the helicopter who were depending on her to survive. She was not just fighting for her own life. She was fighting to prove that Marines never leave anyone behind, even when that someone is fighting for herself. As the afternoon wore on, Maria heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. A Coast Guard rescue helicopter appeared on the horizon, guided by the Marine aircraft still circling overhead. Relief flooded through her exhausted body, but the rescue was far from over. The waves had grown larger, making it dangerous for the helicopter to get close enough for a direct pickup. The rescue swimmer dropped into the water 50 yards away from Maria. She could see him fighting through the waves, his red wetsuit bright against the dark water. Maria tried to swim toward him, but her arms felt like lead weights. Every stroke required enormous effort, and she was making little progress against the current. "Stay where you are," the swimmer shouted over the noise of wind and waves. "I'm coming to you." Those words gave Maria new strength. Help was coming. She just had to hold on a little longer. The swimmer reached her after what felt like an eternity, quickly attaching a rescue harness around her chest. As the helicopter winch lifted them both from the water, Maria looked down at the ocean that had nearly claimed her life. She was alive, but her fight was just beginning. The fall had caused internal injuries that doctors were still discovering. 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, severe bruising throughout her body, and possible spinal damage. The medical team at the military hospital worked around the clock to stabilize her condition. For the first week, Maria drifted in and out of consciousness. Doctors told her family that her recovery was uncertain. Some specialists suggested that her Marine career was over before it had really begun. They spoke quietly about medical discharges and disability benefits, assuming that Maria would accept the end of her military dreams. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Maria Santos had survived a fall that should have killed her. She had spent over 4 hours in the Atlantic Ocean and lived to tell about it. When she finally woke up fully with tubes and monitors attached to her battered body, her first words were not about pain or fear. "When can I get back to training?" she whispered to the nurse. The nurse smiled sadly, thinking Maria was confused from the medications. But Maria's eyes were clear and determined. She had fallen from a helicopter and survived. Now she was going to show everyone what Marines were truly made of. The real fight was just beginning, and Maria Santos had never backed down from a fight in her life. Her mother arrived from Texas the next day, tears streaming down her face as she saw her daughter connected to machines and wrapped in bandages. But instead of the broken girl she expected to find, she discovered a young woman whose spirit burned brighter than ever. "Mija," her mother whispered, "you don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore. Maria squeezed her mother's hand with what little strength she had. Yes, I do, Mama. I have to prove it to myself. Outside her hospital window, other Marines continued their training. Maria could hear the sound of helicopters taking off and landing, the same aircraft that had nearly killed her. Instead of fear, she felt determination. She would heal, she would recover, and she would show everyone that being pushed out of a helicopter was just the beginning of her story, not the end. Hashtag the long road back, the doctors said Maria would never walk normally again. They pointed to x-rays and medical charts explaining how the impact had damaged her spine and left leg. Physical therapy would help, they assured her, but she should prepare for a life with limitations. A medical discharge from the Marines was not just recommended. It was considered inevitable. Maria listened to their careful words and professional assessments. Then, she asked for a phone to call her drill instructor. "Sir, this is Recruit Santos reporting from the hospital," she said when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez answered. "I want to know what I need to do to complete my training." The silence on the other end lasted so long that Maria thought the call had been disconnected. Finally, Rodriguez spoke, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. "Santos, you need to focus on getting better. The Corps will be here when you're ready, if you're ever ready. With respect, sir, I'm ready now. I just need to figure out how to walk first." That conversation became legendary at Paris Island. A recruit who had fallen 200 feet from a helicopter was asking about finishing basic training while still connected to a breathing machine. Word spread quickly through the base. Some thought Maria was crazy. Others recognized something special, the kind of determination that separated real Marines from people who just wore the uniform. The first month of recovery was the hardest of Maria's life. Every movement caused pain that shot through her entire body. Simple tasks like sitting up in bed required enormous effort. The physical therapy sessions were torture, with therapists pushing her to move muscles that screamed in protest. Several times, Maria broke down crying from frustration and pain. But she never once mentioned quitting. Her father visited whenever he could get time off from his construction job. He would sit beside her hospital bed, telling her stories about their family's history. Her great-grandfather had fought with Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution. Her grandfather had served in World War II despite facing discrimination for being Mexican-American. Her father had wanted to join the military himself, but stayed home to care for his sick mother. "You're carrying something bigger than yourself, Mija," he told her during one difficult evening. "You're carrying all of our dreams." That responsibility could have crushed Maria, but instead it lifted her up. When the physical therapist said she couldn't do another repetition, Maria thought about her great-grandfather charging into battle. When the pain in her leg made her want to scream, she remembered her grandfather's stories about surviving in the Pacific Theater. She was not just fighting for herself. She was fighting for generations of family members who had faced their own impossible battles. After 6 weeks in the hospital, Maria was transferred to a military rehabilitation center in San Antonio. The facility specialized in helping injured service members return to active duty. Most patients were recovering from combat wounds, but Maria's case was unique. She was still technically a recruit, not yet a full Marine, who had been injured during training. The rehabilitation center became Maria's new boot camp. She attacked every exercise with the same intensity she had shown on Paris Island. When other patients were resting, Maria was doing extra repetitions. When others complained about the difficulty of their therapy, Maria asked for harder challenges. Her primary therapist was Chief Petty Officer Williams, a Navy veteran who had lost his own leg to an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan. He understood the military mindset better than civilian doctors, and he recognized Maria's special drive immediately. "You remind me of myself when I was learning to walk with a prosthetic," he told her after a particularly grueling session. "Same stubborn streak, same refusal to accept limitations. Did you make it back to active duty?" Maria asked. William smiled and pointed to his artificial leg. "I'm still serving, aren't I? Different job, but still serving." The military finds ways to use people who won't give up. Under Williams' guidance, Maria's recovery accelerated dramatically. Her broken ribs healed cleanly. Her punctured lung returned to full capacity. The spinal damage was less severe than initially feared. But her left leg remained problematic. The impact had caused nerve damage that affected her ability to run and march in the precise manner required of Marines. Most people would have accepted this limitation and moved on with their lives. Maria saw it as simply another obstacle to overcome. She developed her own training regimen that went far beyond the prescribed therapy. Every morning before sunrise, she was in the gym working on her leg strength. She spent hours studying anatomy textbooks, learning exactly which muscles needed strengthening and which movements would help restore her mobility. She consulted with sports medicine specialists, searched for experimental treatments, and tried every technique that might help. The other patients at the rehabilitation center began calling her the machine because of her relentless work ethic. Maria was always the first one in therapy and the last one to leave. She never complained, never made excuses, and never showed self-pity. Her positive attitude began affecting everyone around her. One evening, Maria received an unexpected visitor. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had driven 4 hours from Paris Island to see how she was progressing. He found her in the gym at 9 o'clock at night, working on balance exercises that most people would find impossible even with healthy legs. "Santos, what are you doing here so late?" he asked. "Training, sir. Same thing I was doing when I fell out of that helicopter." Rodriguez watched her complete a series of complex movements that demonstrated remarkable improvement. Her determination had impressed him during boot camp, but this was something entirely different. This was a level of commitment that even veteran Marines rarely displayed. "I have something to tell you," Rodriguez said carefully. "The Corps has decided to offer you a medical discharge with full benefits. You would be considered a Marine who was injured in the line of duty. It's a good deal, Santos. You could go to college on the military's money and start a civilian career." Maria stopped her exercises and looked directly at her former drill instructor. "Sir, with all due respect, I didn't join the Marines to go to college. I joined to serve. If the Corps doesn't want me because of my leg, then I need to fix my leg. Some things can't be fixed, Santos." "Maybe not, sir. But some things haven't been tested hard enough yet." 3 months later, Maria achieved something that medical experts had said was impossible. She walked 20 miles in full combat gear, completing the distance in the time required for active Marines. Her left leg was still weaker than her right, and she had developed a slight limp that would probably never completely disappear. But she could perform every physical requirement expected of a Marine. The rehabilitation center had never seen anything like Maria's recovery. Chief Williams documented her case for medical journals, hoping her story would inspire other injured service members. But Maria was not interested in becoming a medical curiosity. She had one goal: completing her interrupted Marine training. The decision to allow Maria to return to active training was made at the highest levels of the Marine Corps. Generals who had never heard of a recruit from Texas were suddenly discussing her case. Some argued that making an exception would set a dangerous precedent. Others believed that Maria's determination embodied everything the Marines represented. Finally, the commandant of the Marine Corps himself made the decision. Maria Santos would be allowed to attempt completion of her basic training, but she would have to start completely over. The time she had already completed would not count. She would begin as if she were a brand new recruit, with one difference. Everyone would be watching to see if she could really do what she claimed. The night before returning to Paris Island, Maria called her parents from the rehabilitation center. Her mother cried with relief that her daughter was healthy enough to continue pursuing her dreams. Her father spoke quietly about how proud the entire family felt. "You know, this is just the beginning," he told her. "Getting back to training is just the first step." "I know, Papa, but it's the step I needed to take. Everything else comes after." As Maria packed her few belongings, Chief Williams stopped by her room one final time. "You know what you're walking into, right?" They're going to test you harder than any recruit in Marine Corps history. Everyone will be waiting for you to fail." Maria smiled, the same determined expression she had worn when she first announced her intention to join the Marines. "Chief, I fell 200 feet out of a helicopter and lived. I spent 4 hours in the Atlantic Ocean waiting for rescue. I learned to walk again when doctors said it was impossible. If the Marines want to test me, I'm ready." The next morning, as the van carrying Maria back to Paris Island crossed the gate onto the base, she could see helicopters practicing training exercises in the distance. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation. She was about to find out if surviving was enough, or if she truly had what it took to become a Marine. The real test was about to begin. Hashtag earning the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. The second time Maria Santos stepped off the bus at Paris Island, everything was different. The other recruits saw a young woman with scars on her arms and a slight limp in her left leg. The drill instructors saw a living legend, the recruit who had fallen from a helicopter and demanded to come back for more. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was no longer her drill instructor. That honor belonged to Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell, a 25-year veteran who had specifically requested to oversee Maria's training. Mitchell had read every medical report, watched videos of her rehabilitation, and studied her original training records. He knew exactly what Maria had been through, and he was determined to find out what she was truly made of. "Santos." Mitchell's voice boomed across the squad bay on her first morning back. "I hear you think you're special because you survived a little swim in the ocean." "No, sir," Maria responded immediately. "I think I'm here to become a Marine, like everyone else, sir." "We'll see about that. Drop and give me 50 push-ups, and if that leg gives you any trouble, you can pack your bags right now." Maria dropped to the ground and began cranking out push-ups with perfect form. Her left leg trembled slightly, but she completed all 50 without stopping. As she returned to attention, she could see approval flickering in Mitchell's eyes, though his expression remained stern. The next 13 weeks would be the most challenging of Maria's life. Mitchell and his assistant instructors tested her constantly, pushing her harder than any other recruit. They made her carry extra weight during marches to compensate for her leg weakness. They assigned her additional physical training sessions after the regular training day ended. They scrutinized every movement, looking for any sign that her injuries would prevent her from meeting Marine Corps standards. But they also did something unexpected. They turned Maria into an inspiration for her fellow recruits. During the second week of training, the platoon was struggling with a particularly difficult obstacle course. Several recruits had failed multiple attempts, and morale was dropping. Mitchell called the platoon together and pointed to Maria, who had just completed the course despite her obvious physical challenges. "Santos fell 200 feet out of a helicopter and nearly died," Mitchell announced to the shocked recruits. "She spent months learning to walk again, and she just beat half of you on this obstacle course. If she can do it, what's your excuse?" The story spread throughout the training battalion. Other drill instructors began using Maria as an example when their own recruits complained about difficulty or pain. Word reached the base commander, who made a point of observing Maria's training personally. Military reporters heard about the remarkable recruit and requested interviews, which Maria politely declined. She was there to train, not to be famous. The real test came during the 7th week of training, helicopter familiarization exercises. Maria had known this moment was coming since the day she decided to return to Paris Island. She would have to get back into a military helicopter and complete the same type of exercise that had nearly killed her. The medical staff had cleared her for flight training, but everyone understood the psychological challenges she would face. The night before the exercise, Maria lay in her rack thinking about that terrible morning months earlier. She could still remember the sensation of falling, the impact with the water, the hours of floating alone in the ocean. Part of her wondered if she was crazy for putting herself back in the same situation. Then she thought about her fellow Marines who were deployed in combat zones around the world. They flew in helicopters regularly, trusting their lives to aircraft and crews that kept them safe. If she was going to serve alongside them, she needed to prove she could handle the same risks they faced every day. The morning of the flight exercise, Mitchell pulled Maria aside before the platoon departed for the airfield. "Santos, nobody will think less of you if you can't do this," he said quietly. "You've already proven more than most Marines prove in their entire careers." "Thank you, sir, but I didn't come this far to stop now." "Roger that. Then let's go show these helicopters who's boss." The flight to the training area was the longest 30 minutes of Maria's life. She sat in the same type of aircraft, wearing similar gear, following the same route that had led to her accident. Her heart pounded as the helicopter lifted off, and her palms grew sweaty inside her gloves. But she forced herself to breathe steadily and focus on the mission ahead. When the crew chief opened the door for the training exercise, Maria felt a moment of pure panic. The sight of the open door, the sound of wind rushing through the cabin, the view of water far below, everything triggered memories of her fall. Several recruits noticed her hands shaking and moved closer to offer silent support. The exercise required each recruit to move to the door, look out at the landing zone below, and demonstrate proper exit procedures. It was routine training that Maria had done successfully during her first attempt at boot camp, but now it felt like the most dangerous thing she had ever attempted. When her turn came, Maria stepped to the open door with her heart hammering in her chest. She looked down at the training ground 200 feet below and felt dizzy with fear. For a moment, she considered telling the instructors that she couldn't complete the exercise. Then, she heard Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell's voice over the aircraft communication system. "Santos, you've got this. Show that door who's in charge." Maria took a deep breath and completed the exercise flawlessly. She demonstrated proper safety procedures, showed correct positioning, and maintained her composure throughout. When she stepped back from the door, the relief was overwhelming. She had faced her greatest fear and conquered it completely. The other recruits gave her quiet nods of respect. They understood that Maria had just accomplished something far more difficult than a simple training exercise. She had proven that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite being afraid. The remaining weeks of boot camp passed in a blur of intense training and gradual preparation for graduation. Maria's performance continued to improve as her confidence returned. Her left leg grew stronger through constant training, and her limp became barely noticeable. More importantly, she had earned the complete respect of her drill instructors and fellow recruits. 2 weeks before graduation, Maria received news that her story had reached the highest levels of the Marine Corps. The commandant wanted to meet her personally and present her with a special recognition for her determination and perseverance. Military magazines wanted to feature her story. Television programs requested interviews. Maria turned down all the media attention, but she was honored to meet the commandant. During their brief conversation, he asked her what had motivated her to return to training after such a traumatic experience. "Sir, I didn't want my story to end with falling out of a helicopter," Maria replied. "I wanted it to end with becoming a Marine." Graduation day at Paris Island was everything Maria had dreamed about during her darkest moments in the hospital. She stood at attention with her fellow Marines, wearing the dress blue uniform she had earned through months of unimaginable challenge. When her name was called, and she stepped forward to receive her eagle, globe, and anchor, the entire ceremony erupted in applause. Her parents sat in the front row, tears streaming down their faces as they watched their daughter achieve what doctors had said was impossible. Her father wore his best suit and held a small Mexican flag, proud to see his daughter serving the country that had given their family so many opportunities. After the ceremony, Maria was surrounded by family, friends, and fellow Marines who wanted to congratulate her on her achievement. News reporters tried to get her attention, but she was focused on the people who had supported her throughout her journey. Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell approached her as the crowd began to disperse. "Congratulations, Marine Santos," he said formally, then smiled and added, "You've set a standard that recruits will be trying to meet for decades to come." "Thank you, sir, for everything. What's next for you?" Maria looked around at the base where she had fallen from a helicopter, nearly died, fought her way back to health, and finally earned the title of United States Marine. She thought about the long road that had brought her to this moment and the challenges that still lay ahead. "I'm going to be the best Marine I can be, sir. Same goal I had when I first got here." 6 months later, Lance Corporal Maria Santos was deployed to Afghanistan, where she served with distinction as a helicopter crew chief. The same aircraft that had nearly killed her became her workplace and her responsibility. She flew hundreds of missions, helping transport troops and supplies throughout the combat zone. During her deployment, Maria received a letter from a young girl in Texas who had heard her story. The girl was facing her own challenges, bullying at school, family problems, and teachers who said she would never amount to much. She wanted to know how Maria had found the strength to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. Maria sat in her tent in Afghanistan, surrounded by the sounds of helicopters and military equipment, and wrote back to the girl. She told her about falling from the sky and finding the strength to climb back up. She explained that courage was not about never being afraid, but about doing what needed to be done despite the fear. Most importantly, she told the girl that everyone has their own helicopter moment, a time when life pushes them out of their comfort zone and forces them to discover what they're truly made of. The key is not avoiding these moments, but learning to fly even after you fall. Years later, when Maria had completed multiple deployments and earned promotion to sergeant, she would often speak to groups of young people about overcoming obstacles and pursuing impossible dreams. She always ended her presentations the same way. "I was pushed out of a helicopter and survived. That fall taught me that the ground is never as far away as it looks when you're falling. And more importantly, it taught me that Marines don't just defy gravity. We defy anyone who says we can't do something." Maria Santos never did learn to be afraid of helicopters again. Instead, she learned that the most dangerous thing you can do is let fear stop you from becoming who you're meant to be. Sometimes you have to fall from the sky to discover you already know how to fly. Her story became part of Marine Corps legend, told to new recruits who face their own seemingly impossible challenges. It reminded them that the title Marine was not given to people who never fell down, but to people who got back up no matter how far they had fallen. And in a small frame in Maria's home, alongside her military decorations and commendations, hung a simple photograph of a helicopter in flight. Below, it was a handwritten note. "Some falls are just the beginning of learning how to soar."